Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We've treated South Korea as a military colony. South Korea doesn't need us. They have almost 50 million people living in that place. It is one of the most productive and successful economies in the world. Its economy is larger than Russia's. Now, stop and consider for a minute, why is it that we maintain 26,000 U.S. Army troops on the peninsula? Well, there are a lot of reasons. It's this hegemony obsession. It's also because the Department of War understands that once those forces come out, there will be questions about the justification for the force structure. So you cling to whatever you have overseas as a commitment, whether we need it or not, in order to maintain your force structure. But in the meantime, the Chinese have stepped up and said, look, we understand that you've got problems with the Americans right now. Let's be frank. If the Americans leave, you can be neutral. That way you can trade with everybody. And we will discuss the future with North Korea. In other words, Beijing will determine North Korea's destiny. And Beijing looks at South Korea and North Korea. North Korea is essentially circling the drain, is heavily dependent on whatever it can get from Russia and China to survive. And South Korea is the opposite. It's this burgeoning powerhouse of economic strength. So with whom do you want to do business? Well, obviously South Korea, and China has a land office business with South Korea. What China wants to do is gradually, over time, not instantly, not tomorrow morning, but over time, help the Koreans to become one country again. So it's time for us to leave. We should have left Korea 10, 20 years ago.
Right.
But, for the reasons I've outlined, we've stayed. Well, now President Trump, in the wrong way, is helping us get out. And I think we should get out. But unfortunately, by the time we leave, we're not going to have large crowds of Koreans cheering and waving goodbye. It's going to be ugly.
Will Korea, whether you call it, or the South calls it South Korea, so will South Korea or will a unified Korea ever be neutral?
I think so. I do. But again, in the Orient, everyone has patience.
Right.
They're all willing to wait for decades for things to happen. Remember the original date, I think it was 2046, it had been mentioned by President Xi years ago for reunification with Taiwan. And that was just a temporary date that he fixed and said, that, we're looking at that as a target date. He didn't say, if we don't get it, then we invade. We keep trying to portray China as some sort of imperial Japanese force that wants to overrun Asia. They don't want that. It's bad for business. These people are smart. They want to do business. They're not interested in war. So there's patience there. There's patience in Korea. There's patience in Japan. There's patience in Beijing. And by the way, Beijing isn't going to do anything, nor is Korea going to do anything without consulting the Japanese. That's the way things are done over there.
Wow. I hate to play this, but I have to because we're talking about this part of the world. I mean, it's really deplorable. This is Senator Darlene Graham, the sister of the late Senator Lindsey Graham, who was appointed to replace him, was asked a simple question. Senator, are Taiwan and the South China Sea national security issues for the United States, and if so, why? Watch the answer, Colonel. Chris, number 23.
Senator, are Taiwan and the South China Sea national security issues for the United States? If so, why?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Are Taiwan and the South China Sea national security issues for the United States, and if so, why or how?
I'm just going to be honest here. I'm not on national security. I'm not that informed on national security, but I do support the military. My brother was in the Air Force for 33 years, so I will do everything I can to support the military. My dad was in the Army. I'm not a polished politician up here. National security is not my thing, not my area of expertise, but I do support the military.
They're tool/fool for the neocons, the Zionists, and the Republican establishment. They'll tell her how to vote.
Well, unfortunately, you're right. She will end up being a Zionist APEC puppet, probably. But I give her high marks for honesty. I mean, I have to. That kind of integrity is so rare in Washington, D.C., that it's laudable. And the sad truth is that, Judge, most people in Washington, D.C. don't understand these things. I spoke to a senator a couple of years ago. He's a very prominent man now. And we got under the topic of China. And I said, Senator, have the Chinese ever stopped a commercial vessel moving through the South China Sea or the Strait of Malacca? And he said, I don't know, but I've been reading Gordon Chang's book. I said, well, put the book down. And we've got to answer that question. He said, well, what's the answer? I said, no, they never have. China is interested in ensuring that the South China Sea is a passage for everybody, not just themselves, but they have a history of watching the British, the Japanese, and us potentially bottle them up. The British and the Japanese did bottle up their ports and control it. So I give her credit for at least admitting that. The bad news is you're undoubtedly right. The people that put her there are going to expect her to do what they tell her to do.
Colonel, yesterday the federal government's debt reached 40 trillion. It wasn't a surprise. We could all see it coming. I thought it would come a little later, but it came yesterday. Earlier in the week, the Secretary of the Treasury announced that the United States government would be buying back its bonds, essentially repaying the loans for people who had loaned it money. So many people lined up to have their loans repaid that the government didn't have the cash with which to do it. So is the government now going to borrow money in order to pay back borrowed money? If the answer to that is yes, this is no way to run a railroad.
Well, we've been running this railroad the wrong way for decades. And our sovereign national debt has practically doubled just in the last 10 years. So we need to stop and think about that. Talk about reckless spending. The problem, Judge, is as follows. Besant decided to step in and buy these long-term bonds at 30 years because he was interested not just in suppressing the yields, that is the rate of return. He also wanted to ensure that the 10-year yield went down. The 10-year is very sensitive. It is really the bellwether of imminent destruction. And so he acted on this, and he was confident that this would be well received in the markets. It wasn't. And what's happened is that people are literally saying, we don't believe you. We don't trust the federal government. We don't trust the United States. We can't believe in you anymore. So if you want us to give you any money, you're going to have to let these yields rise naturally. And guess what the yield did? It rose.
Yeah.
We thought he was suppressing it. No, it rose. Why is that? Because the Treasury and the Fed are not in control. They're not controlling anything anymore. So what's the next step? And that's what everybody's asking. And unfortunately, I think we're going to print a lot of money.
Yeah, both yields rose. The 10, but the 10 stunned him. The 30, he knew it was going to go up. Wow.
Yeah, and look, this is bad news. You hit 5%. There's no one that disagrees out there with the notion that once you're over 5% on the 10-year, you're going to collapse financially because you cannot service the debt. That's an impossibility.
Right.
This whole scheme of borrowing in order to maintain a much higher standard of living than we are earning with what our economy puts out, which is one problem, is ending. There's another problem. It's the reckless spending on everything else. Look at what we're doing in the war against a supposed enemy that is not an existential threat. And quite frankly, I disagree. I don't think Iran is an enemy of the United States, nor does it need to be. But it doesn't make any difference. We've gone into this. We can't afford it. So we're back to this issue you and I have discussed before. Which happens first? Do we finally throw up our arms after the next round of pointless attacks and say, that's it, we're out? Or do we collapse here at home financially first? Well, I think we don't know the answer to that question, but it looks like we're going to end up doing both.
Colonel, the government is a Ponzi scheme. If you borrow money to pay back borrowed money, eventually that train stops. Now the president, while we're talking about China, and I have so many other topics for you, but I got to get this in. said that he will engage in, I think he used the word, the most vicious economic repression that's ever been engaged in to suppress the Iranian economy by imposing secondary tariffs on anybody that does business with Iran. Is he going to attack Chinese banks, many of whom own collectively 2 trillion of that 40 trillion in debt?
It looks bad, and the right course of action for President Trump at this point is when he meets with President Xi. I think he's scheduled to meet in September with him. It's a one-day trip. The discussion should be, Mr. President, our currency is in trouble. Our economy is in trouble. Let's sit down and discuss how we resolve this dispute in the Gulf quickly. And secondly, what you and we can do together to deal with the currency problem and, frankly, the lack of liquidity in the United States and our falling economy. Nobody wants to do that because that means that we're humbling ourselves. But it's time for some humility because that's the best way out.
Right.
The solution in the Gulf today is very clear. It's over. We lost. Now, you can walk out without necessarily signing an agreement, and you can come to terms later on when the war is over and the bloodletting stops, because I think that could work. But you've got to be honest. And I think our strategic partners in the region understand this. The one that doesn't and wants to go on to the bitter end in the hopes that it will somehow or another work in their favor is, of course, Israel.
Right.
And Israel and its agents in the United States absolutely will oppose any move by this country to end its conflict with Iran.
Is Israel about to go to war with Turkey?
I don't think about is the right word, but I think we're seeing something that we've talked about in the past. I recall that when we first saw this sudden agreement that we crafted to protect Israel and its Greater Israel Project, which resulted effectively in the division of Syria into spheres of influence. And the Israelis said, we're going to take the south up to Damascus, and maybe someday we'll take Damascus. They didn't say that, but that's what they thought. But at the moment, we're going to take the south up to Damascus. And the Turks said, all right, but then you have to put in this ISIS government that we have now working there. That government will be allied to us, and we'll control the rest. In return, the Israelis were also supposed to rein in the Kurds. That really hasn't happened. That remain a permanent threat to Turkey. So it's been a rough and rocky road. I characterize it as the equivalent of the Nazi-Soviet pact that divided Poland. That was a temporary solution, a temporary measure. It was never going to be permanent. Everybody knew that. The question was what would bring it down and who would attack first. I think we're in a similar situation today. The Turks are not going to start a war overnight with the Israelis, but the Israelis are pushing very hard in that direction. And I think, again, they're doing what they're doing and behaving as they are because they control us and they control our armed forces.
Earlier this week, Colonel, the Kremlin warned the United Kingdom that there will be consequences to its provision of long-range drones and missiles for attacks inside of Russia. Now, President Putin himself used the phrase, there will be consequences. What might those consequences be, Colonel McGregor?
Well, President Putin said that the consequences could occur anywhere on the planet. In other words, he did not limit himself to saying, we will identify where the recent drones that were flown into Russia were developed, where the engines were made and the improved rocket bodies were developed. We'll take one of your ships. We'll seize things of importance to you. We can operate on a global basis. I don't know what he's going to do, but I know that in Ukraine right now, we had within the last couple of days, 1,800 glide bombs delivered against targets in Ukraine. Now, that's about 70 sorties of bomber runs. That's phenomenal. You're talking about tens of thousands of tons of bombs. The war on the ground in Ukraine is definitely ramping up. and the forces are on the move, and they're closing in, particularly in the south on Zaporizhia, and I think eventually on Odessa. So he's definitely accelerating the campaign, and I think they want to gain serious territory, not for the purpose of conquering it, because frankly, they really don't want to rule anybody who's not a Russian, but they're going to complete what they set out to do with New Russia, Novorossiya. But beyond that, I think he's going to continue to exercise restraint because he's watching Europe. And I'll be frank, I find it impossible to believe that the current government in London is going to last much longer. This new prime minister is almost an empty suit. If anything, he's doubled down on the stupidity overseas. And at the same time, the state of the British armed forces is more perilous now than it's been since before the Napoleonic Wars. So it's hard to believe that anything serious is going to happen there, but you could see open rebellion in Great Britain. And I think we're getting close to that.
Why, maybe you can put on your military historian hat. Why are present day Germany and present day United Kingdom despised by average Russians and by the Kremlin?
Well, first of all, I think we need to distinguish populations from governments. I do think there is an understanding that they're dealing with governments that they regard as evil. Now, of course, you have this unfortunate element inside Ukraine and inside the Ukrainian government that sports these swastikas and other Nazi symbols, which are deeply offensive and repugnant to anybody with a brain who understands anything that happened during World War II. The Russians are particularly sensitive to it for obvious reasons. They don't understand why the Germans or the British would engage in this sort of thing. Well, I can tell you in Germany, the majority of the German population, if you look at the polling data, has no interest in conflict with Russia at all. None. The majority of the population in both Britain and in Russia, these majorities are disinterested in anything that you would call a military draft. They're all opposed to it. What you have are governments that are on life support, that are ruling through machination. In other words, they're rigging elections. They're making alliances at the local as well as national level, doing anything they can to stop the nationalist parties or nationalist elements from taking over. Because the nationalist parties and elements in all of the European countries are not focused on destroying Russia. Far from it. They're focused on bringing their countries back from the brink, of restoring their economic health and driving out millions and millions and millions of non-Europeans that don't belong in their countries, they were never asked. Their government simply said, by all means, bring everybody in. They don't want it. That's their focus. So I think the Russians understand that. And I think and I say Russians, I'm talking about the government. So I think they will exercise restraint, believing that the 11th hour has arrived in the European states. And these European states are going to be so absorbed domestically with their own problems, there will be no further nonsense in terms of supporting Ukraine. And by the way, they're looking at our economic condition. They're looking at what's happening on Wall Street. They're looking at the bond market crash. And they're beginning to wonder how much longer we can maintain this steady flow of funds and support into Ukraine, let alone against Iran. And they're right. They're right to be patient at this point.
Is President Putin still retaining his patience?
I think he's the most patient man in Russia.
Maybe on the planet outside of the Chinese.
Yeah. And we should be perpetually grateful. Whenever I hear somebody say, I hate Putin, or this, first of all, nobody knows the man. Nobody knows much about him. And a lot of what is said about him is made up, as you would imagine. We always tend to try and transform everybody we don't like into another version of Saddam Hussein. That's the neocon Zionist AIPAC model. And they're all in for the destruction of Russia, just as they're all in for the destruction of Iran. And I think it's absurd. But again, here's something else. No one in the United States is interested in either of those wars. Nobody cares. Look at the polling data. Everybody wants out. Everybody's focused here. And they're worried about how much more inflation, more bond buyouts are going to introduce into the United States.
But look at this. Chris put up the slide that we just texted about. Here's a crew in the United States that wants war. AIPAC boasting that more than 254 people running for the House of Representatives and the Senate are having their campaigns financed by AIPAC, in many cases, both parties, so they can't lose. This is what Trump is confronting.
Well, yeah, of course he confronts it, but he's made it worse.
Yes.
He's been the principal champion. That's why Americans are realizing they don't have a government that represents their interests. Now, in fairness to some of the people on the list, I know some of them, they do not support these wars, but they're afraid not to take the money. They're afraid not to vote for something they know is bad and wrong and damaging. So to be frank, I think things are going to have to get worse, and they will.
Yeah.
We're now on the edge of collapse. We're staring into the proverbial abyss. There's no way out. You can't just keep on buying up debt, putting it on a phony ledger, pretending it doesn't matter. We've crossed the Rubicon. Everybody knows that, but people want to desperately believe the inevitable can be postponed. But every market analyst, everyone who looks at the situation says we can't postpone the cataclysm that's now scheduled. We had opportunities to cut spending. We could have stayed out of these wars. We could have cut back on this defense budget, $1.5 trillion, which is absurd, but we've done the opposite.